Good to do that. Yeah. Welcome back to Exile Radio. We're on it.
Welcome back to Wisdom in Exile Radio, this wild ride through the swamps of samsara. We're back with Paul and Norin, our good friends, and today we are going to be discussing chapter 7 of Lama Jampa's book, Wisdom in Exile, Buddhism and Modern Times. And the topic of today is learning the craft. So this is a chapter about learning how to learn Buddhism, which isn't necessarily how we learn other things. There's a certain way that you learn Buddhism, and the way that Lama Jampa breaks down this chapter, well, he doesn't break it down this way, but you could structure it. It's roughly structured in terms of the 3 stages of learning: hearing, thinking, and meditating.
So each of us is in a way exiled from our natural capacity for wisdom. And that's actually, of course, what Buddha addresses in his teaching, that although all beings, not just humans in fact, but all beings have this capacity for enlightenment, for awakening, it is obscured in them. And it's only by meeting the path, by practicing the threefold path of hearing, thinking and meditating, that we can, as it were, recover that wisdom from which all of us are alienated.
Let's start with the first of those, hearing. Norin, what is hearing, and what are some of the pertinent points that Lama Jampa makes about this in terms of modern Buddhism and modern times?
Yeah, okay. Well, like all of the chapters in the book, each chapter kind of flows, like the previous one is very relevant to this one, basically. And so hearing is underpinned by the fact that you have to have found an authentic teacher in the first place to listen to. And, that was what the previous chapter was all about, making sure that you find an authentic teacher. And there's been a theme of that, a thread of that throughout the whole book. And this chapter reinforces it. And the fact that it's reinforced continually through the book, it speaks for itself that is a very important element of hearing, is that you have to have found an authentic teacher to listen to in the first place. But once you do, Lama makes some very important points about how, like, one of the quotes I underlined was how we've filled our minds with nothing. Here it is. All too often our heads are already full of too much information about nothing, and there's no space for anything else. And that made me think back to chapter 2, again, this thread where in the Space for Buddhism, Lama says, when one adds to the flaws of scientism and political ideology the danger to the human capacity for stillness, reflection, and wise judgment, that is signaled by the proliferation of electronic media to satisfy our immediate desires. So it's like we're so immersed in a culture where there are so many distractions, we have literally forgotten the craft of hearing. We've forgotten how to be still and how to listen and how to kind of cut out all of the chatter. And that, I think, is really why it's alluding to shamatha meditation, which is a foundational practice of Buddhism. You have to still your mind so that it can be receptive to the teachings.
Yeah. Paul, any thoughts on that?
Hearing, thinking, meditating. So, I mean, one point, isn't it, he makes is like, he asks, why do we even need to say, how do we learn Buddhism? And, why is he talking about it? And again, like previous chapters, the dangers of conceits, thinking we already know everything, and pointing out that we don't know how to learn Buddhism, because it's actually very different from how we learn things in the West generally. And you see that a lot with people coming to our classes to learn Buddhism. In the West, our normal approach, isn't it, is you read a book, you learn something, you maybe go to some classes and lectures, you learn a bit more, and then you go get the next book, and then you go to the next class, and you go to the next level of teach classes, and it's just a purely intellectual exercise. So maybe we'll talk more about why that's not enough, and why reflection and meditating are so important. But to Paul's point, isn't it? First, you've got to listen, and what do you listen to? You need to listen to teachings from authentic teachers, and there's a lot of stress about, well, what is it you need to hear? It's the teachings that come through the lineage. So there's a lot of emphasis here how it's not the individual teacher or the personality of the teacher that's important, but the role of an authentic teacher is to pass on the power and the transmission of the lineage of teachings that goes directly back to Lord Buddha himself. And there's a sort of a power or a blessing to that direct lineage of transmission that gives the teachings its power, rather than being, people just sort of making things up or tweaking things to meet modern tastes. If it's authentic, it's grounded in that living tradition. So hearing's got to be from someone that is a authentic representative of that tradition, and their job is then to transmit those teachings to us. And the first point then for learning Dharma is you've got to hear the teachings, and then we'll move into those next phases.
It does talk about the different paths people come to reach Buddhism. And that made me think, when I was listening to you, about your motivation for hearing, and Hinayana and Mahayana motivations. Because in the first couple of paragraphs, Lama talks about how you can just be disillusioned with the shallowness of contemporary culture, or you may have encountered some overwhelming tragedy, like we touched on that last week. But so you can listen with a motivation that is for your own. Like, you're lost, I need to listen to the Dharma teachings because I'm seeking the Hinayana motivation. Or you can listen from the perspective of the Mahayana, and then there are also different teachings on how to listen. Like, when Lama gives initiations, or any Lama gives initiations, they talk about the vase metaphor, about how it has to be not have a hole in the bottom. You have to be able to retain the teachings, and again, it's like taking refuge. You have to have the right motivation to listen to the teachings if you want them to have any kind of meaningful benefit.
The vase analogy is the student should be like a vase when receiving teachings, like filling water with a vase. It can't have a hole in the bottom. It can't be inverted. It has to be the right way up, so the water goes inside. And it can't have poison in it, which is like an interior. You poison everything that you can. If your mind is sort of already poisoned, the teachings can come in and they still get poisoned. Norin, one thing I remembered when you were talking about how we learn is I read a quote from Evelyn Waugh, the English novelist, talking about education after the First World War, and he said how it changed. And so I wonder whether as moderns, like the way we learn is quite, and think about learning, is quite different to how it was in the old world. Because he said in the old days, people, what was happening in education was all these kids were getting taught to give their opinions. He literally says this in an article. He says, like, all these kids have been taught is to recite their opinions, and they've been kind of fawned over, like their opinions all matter, and they're just children. Their opinions actually don't matter. And he said what they should have been done is taught Greek paradigms, i.e. just recite by rote the Greek grammar. And his point was there was something in the old system of memorization by rote. Of course, goodness knows what's going on in the latest theories in education. I'm sure the comment section will blow up as a result of me saying this, but yeah, education and learning have changed in modernity to how they were. Memorization was a very big part of how you learned stuff. And I think the concept of hearing in Dharma does traditionally have a connotation of memorization. And then the subsequent steps that come on from that are actually more about digesting what you've memorized. But you begin with memorization, and I think it's fair to say that's not how people learn these days.
Yeah, that is so true and on point. Yeah, I mean, people really struggle with that, and so I mean, that's exactly if we don't see. I think most people who listen to this podcast probably know it, isn't it? But you do have to memorize the text, and shorter text you memorize verbatim, and that way you can go over it and reflect and all the rest of it. And then another text, you remember the structure, isn't it? You remember the key areas and then the subtopics, so you can teach it back to yourself, and then that way you can really dig in and see if you actually understand what it means and what the points are really trying to get to. When yeah, exactly right, isn't it? Listening has that aspect, and so like again, our classes, I always encourage people to take notes, because you got to take notes, or you're never going to have a chance of them memorizing it later, especially nowadays, because that's it. We're not taught to learn like that.
Yeah, it's amazing how we forget, and I think how well, certainly in my own case, how much I've overestimated in the past how much I'm taking in and commit to memory. Because I remember, like Lama Jumper pointing out, you should write down what teachings you had, because you will forget. To the point of, there's some initiations which I didn't always do, of course, to my failing of mine, I didn't always do that. I thought, I'll remember. How could I possibly forget traveling 4 hours to get this teaching, sitting through it all day and then going home? But the reality is there are a couple of teachings. I'm not sure whether I got them or not. I've literally forgotten. And unfortunately, I didn't write it down. And now I'm not sure. So I sort of have to assume that I didn't get it. But yeah, it's amazing how
you have to remember like which lineage you received the initiation from. It's not enough to just write down that I got, Chenrezig initiation. It's like, well, which lineage,
Yeah.
But you made an interesting point about backtrack a little bit about how children's opinions don't matter in terms of how we learn, because I think that will be that might tweak a few people's sensibilities.
I just want to point out that was Evelyn Waugh said that. I remain
okay.
I haven't given an opinion on that. So,
but it's still an interesting point about how we learn, is that we've lessened the importance of the teacher's value, and we've given the rise of individualism in our society, which goes back to like how we've traced, since the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, the importance of individuals and their opinions has kind of transplanted the way we learn. Like traditionally, there was a disciple and master. There was an expert, a subject expert on something, and you would have a very humble approach to how you learn things. But now our culture is very much about everyone's opinion is valid and important. And it's also muddied with feelings as well. Like your feelings are very important. It's important not to offend anyone. And that's very much a part of how we learn these days. And that isn't, that's a challenge, I think, to the traditional way we learn Buddhism. And you see with all the secular attempts at Buddhism to try and bridge that and lessen the impact of Buddhism in doing so. I think Lama mentioned something about how to make Buddhism easier turns out to be to water it down, and that inevitably means that the medicine is diluted. And there is a tendency in our culture to make things a little bit more palatable. And in doing so, it loses its potency.
Yeah, he calls them revolutionary teachers in inverted commas, because and he sort of hints at the fact, I think, well, my reading of it is that some of these innovations and revolutions in how to present Dharma to the modern world are not very revolutionary. They're actually extremely, in a way, they're conservative, because because Dharma is truly revolutionary. It requires this revolution, interior revolution against selfishness and self-clinging. But a lot of these supposedly revolutionary takes on Dharma are actually just turning it into something very mainstream, just that doesn't at all disagree with the mainstream culture or your natural tendency for self-clinging.
Right. We've made we've made a virtue of trying to think outside the box in our culture. It's like that. I hear that all the time. You've got to think outside the box. Think outside the box. But in doing so, we've forgotten the importance of what's in the box. And you really have to master what's inside the box before you can even attempt to begin to think outside the box. And we're so arrogant now that we're like, oh, I can skip what's in the box and immediately just intuit and follow my gut and just jump outside of it because I know.
Yeah, I think that's so true. It's like people don't know how to have a proper body of knowledge within which to then form opinions. We've skipped over the body of knowledge thing, so people don't learn things. So what they really learn is a superficial agreements and understanding of the common secular views on what the world is about, with a very superficial understanding of history, usually very, very on history. And then, have all these opinions that they think they're their own, but actually they've just absorbed from our mainstream society, which is also why opinions just keep shifting and changing, and you get these new fads just come up from seemingly accelerated pace, maybe because of the social media and so on. But because people aren't educated nowadays, and I had a terrible education when I was young, so I'm not really one to say how to try and fill many of the gaps, and still many gaps. But without that body of knowledge, it's very difficult to form opinions. And I guess it's coming back to the Dharma, isn't it? It's similar to Dharma. You're often these innovative teachers haven't learned the Dharma already, like through hearing, thinking, meditating. They have quite a superficial understanding. Maybe they've been a monk for a couple of years somewhere or did a retreat somewhere, and then they think they know it all. But they're cleverer than the older Buddhists, because we've got all modern secularism and science, so they can make it better. But often you scratch the surface and there's just no real deep understanding or there.
Something else I've been thinking about lately is on the other side of that. On the other hand, there's this innovation of Buddhism that goes on in the West, in modern world, that is highly intellectually centered. That and it's made up of academics and very, very intelligent and learned people writing these huge tomes often. And what they're doing is, but it's relevant here because what they're doing is they're obsessed with early Buddhism, basically. It's a sort of Protestant, it's an old Protestant compulsion again. So let's go back to what Buddhism is really about. The assumption is, without really much checking at all the traditions are corruptions. That's our starting point. They're obviously corruptions. Well, let's just agree on that. But then there's also this idea that we can get real Buddhism by going back to the texts, the early sutras. Let's just dismiss the whole tradition. But actually, in a way, the opposite is true. The true spirit of Buddhism is in the tradition and is in the teacher-student living connection. And what's in the texts is sort of, in a way, dead until a teacher with true experiential familiarity and experience of the teachings can bring it back to life or can communicate it. But you must have seen these people going on about early Buddhism and just dismissing like all of the Tibetan, Zen, Theravada, just dismissing the living traditions, just assuming that they don't know what Buddhism is.
Yeah. So no, it's a really good point. So a good example of that to kind of to bring it home to people would be, I was thinking when I read this chapter about Milarepa, because when he first sought out initiation and the Dharma, he went to one teacher, I think it was Rongton Laga, who taught him Dzogchen, because it was a very immediate instruction. I think he said something like, you go to sleep, you learn it, and next day you're enlightened type of thing. It's immediate. And it's a legitimate teaching, but it wasn't appropriate for Milarepa because he had so much negative karma. And so it's individualized. So, and that's why he had to go to Marpa, and that's why he had to build all the towers and go through this process of purging his negative karma. And because it was individualized, it was specific for Milarepa. So you can't kind of, like you say, you can't rely exclusively on the textual instructions. You have to have the element of a teacher who can individualize it and apply it to you. And that's, like you say, is the why it's a living tradition. And it's that interaction between student and the guru that makes it real.
I think in the book, isn't it, it says about how if you're left to your own devices, you're going to pick those bits of Dharma that you want and that you like, and ignore the ones you don't. So you need a teacher who can actually point out our own needs as well, and our own neurosis, and someone that is already obviously trained and realized in those teachings. But does it also come back to the teachings of the Buddha and the sutras themselves, which Buddha always taught in response to questions from individuals, and that's the nature of the original discourses. And then the later masters sort of stitched them together into more systematic presentations. But to your point, I guess that's still, though, that living tradition is always still taught in that way, even though it can draw on the shastras that were written later and systematize them. But always the teacher teaches in response to the individual student about what teachings they should be studying, what teachings they should aim to receive at some point, what practices they should do at a particular point in time. And it's always different from person to person. And I remember because in our community we've had a few attempts or thoughts about systematizing how we teach Dharma in our groups and classes and so on. And but I know Lama Jump has always sort of shied away from that, even though it's more familiar to the Western mind, and you get a lot of other Buddhist groups in the West trying to structure it in that way. But Buddhism has just never been taught like that. It's not cookie cutter. You do your undergrad degree, then you could do a master's degree, then you do a PhD, now you're an expert. In Buddhism, it's all about it's not about the intellect per se, is it? It's about how to remedy our disturbing emotions and the causes of our own suffering, which is a lot deeper than intellectual ideas.
Yeah, primarily. But there was an intellectual tradition, and they did have a university system with various qualifications. So there was an intellectual tradition. It's just that wasn't all there was, and it wasn't necessary or sufficient for realization of the path. But there's always a need in a culture in a tradition like that for a strong intellectual tradition to defend against objections and so on.
Yeah, I wasn't saying that there isn't a need for that, and there isn't a need for and that's your point. Especially in Tibet, there's very systematic, very great levels of scholarship. I guess what I was saying, but the purpose of Buddhism isn't to become a scholar. Right. Even though you need scholarship as a support so you can, but it's not the purpose of Buddhism. We're not trying to become super intellectuals who understands everything that's written down about Buddhism, or you'd be missing the whole point. Yeah,
and a characteristic of these early Buddhists, the people who think they can somehow reconstruct Buddhism from the sutras, it is only an intellectual system, really. There's no experience. But the other thing I just wanted to say about that, which I think is an interesting thought, talking about the decline of the Dharma, and how the Buddha predicted that in the last 500 years of the Dharma, before it disappeared completely, there would be a period of 500 years where only the texts existed. The text would still exist in the world, but no one would have experiential realization of them. So the Buddha literally says that there won't be any genuine teachers, but the sutras will still exist, and people will sort of pretend to respect them, but it won't have any benefit because no one knows really the spirit of it and the inner heart of it. And it's so interesting, I think, now that there's such a strong movement, all these people pushing for that situation to come about by dismissing the traditions, saying that that's not real Buddhism. Let's go back to only the texts and start again. They're ushering in this final stage of Buddhism that Buddha predicted is coming.
But is that what a segue then to say, talk about reflection and meditate?
So the second of the three ways of learning, the three steps of learning Dharma, is thinking or reflecting. So Paul, what is thinking and reflecting, and how does that work in modern times?
Yeah, so having heard the Dharma or listened to the Dharma, like you say, the next step is reflection, which really means trying to understand and challenge and question what the teachings are trying to say and what the real point of it is. So it's a bit like in Buddhism, hearing and even memorizing is only the start. You've then got to internalize it. So it moves in a way from being like an intellectual idea into something in one's heart and what we are. And the only way to do that is to really engage with it and test it against our own experience, our own beliefs, and so on. So I guess it's a process that, hearing, thinking, meditating is a process. It says in the book, we enter, this is something we're doing our whole life, and we never in a way stop, even on a single text. We may have a period of, we've heard a text, we then reflect on it for, weeks or months, really studying it and questioning it. Meditation we'll talk about later, but then we'll come back to it, a few years later, and go back again to sort of really deepen our understanding. And maybe one last point. So, it's really, there's the point here that it's not enough, like we say, blind faith in Buddhism in a way. If we want to practice seriously, isn't enough. You can't just accept the teachings as true, or it won't change you. And it would be like, in a way, wasted. So the only way it can change you is if you really do honestly engage with it and question it, and not be afraid to question it, and admit where we have doubts, or admit where something doesn't click for us, and then we work through that.
Yeah, he talks about the necessity for a certain amount of bravery, actually, isn't it? Because you sort of need to question it to the point where you need to ask questions where it's like, if this question it has an answer that I don't like, that might be the end for me. You need to sort of you need to go right up to the precipice, don't you? There needs to be a bravery.
You have these many opportunities in day-to-day life on how to actually enact them, whether it is just thinking of somebody else instead of yourself first, and all of these kind of moral examples about how to behave and how to create karma.
Yeah, but I think there's a bit of an overlap there, because there's a quote in the book, isn't it, from Vasubandhu that says, on the basis of moral discipline, practice hearing, thinking, and meditating. So I think what Asa was saying is, this chapter is more about hearing, thinking, meditating, but moral discipline and ethical behavior is always really the foundation of a Buddhist society and Buddhism. So he says there's an element of, I guess you do need to hear, think, meditate maybe a bit to know what ethical discipline is, to put that in everyday life. So there is sort of an overlap, but I guess it's also, I don't know. I just this seems slightly different from the topic here in terms of, say, for example, we're learning about the four thoughts, four thoughts, center, mind, to Dharma. That has a bit on karma and activity. So yeah, you can learn that and try and practice for 10 virtues, avoid the 10 non-virtues, and so on. So there's that element. But then to really dig into, say, that teaching on karma, and all the teachings on how karma accumulates, why is it that good actions lead to happiness, bad actions lead to suffering? How does that translate into habits of mind, and why is it, we're in the situations and encounters we have? How does that work? There's sort of a lot deeper understanding about karma we can go into, and I think that's here, the reflection and meditation deepens that, isn't it, understanding or whatever, which then does support your activity as well, about why you're doing it, why it makes sense, and why your confidence in why you should avoid killing and practice saving lives or whatever.
Some people might say there's a difference between Buddhism as philosophy and Buddhism as religion. So, but then he mentions that that's a very Western distinction to make. We never had that in Asian countries. Philosophy as a sort of secular thing, and religion as separate from secular life wasn't really a distinction that they had. So Buddhism, theism, materialism, they're world views. You sort of live in them, and your whole life is from within the perspective of that. So most people are materialistic, whether or not they identify as such. So everything in their life is materialistic. Their relationships, their aspirations and ambitions, their death, is understood and interpreted in a materialistic way. But for a Buddhist, all these things would have a different significance. Whereas to treat Buddhism as a philosophy is to say I can compartmentalize it, and separate it from all of those things. It's just a set of fancy ideas, which is sort of how mindfulness works. It's a compartment. I can put it into my materialistic worldview, and everything just goes along just great.
Yeah, I mean, Lama Jumper certainly said that in other contexts as well. How I guess our Westerners, we do want to compartmentalize everything. But when you're practicing Dharma, it just pervades everything you do, isn't it? Whether it's because it's often like people ask you, what's your priorities in life? Is it, do you live to work or do you work to live?
Those are the two options.
Yeah. And but for Dharma, it's like, work, for all its difficulties, is a way to train in Dharma. Family, with all its good and bad, is a way to train in Dharma. And everything we can make with Dharma. So when I go for a run in the morning, you can make that practice of the Dharma. If you're having a cup of coffee, you practice Dharma. That's why every time before you eat or drink, you do prayers and offer it to the Buddhas. You visualize. It becomes part of the path. When you sleep, the visualizations before you sleep, and it's part of Dharma. When you wake up and visualize yourself waking, the deity is, it's like, that's the thing, is it? I think you're good to bring that point up. This, Buddhism, it doesn't fit into the way Westerners think about religion. Or is it secular, or is it religious, or is it this or that? It's all pervasive.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to meditation. So he says, so thinking was about resolving hesitations and uncertainties through intelligent, sustained reflection. This leads us into meditation, where the reflection is translated into actual experience. So this is the third way of learning Buddhism and generating wisdom is meditation. So what is meditation? How is it different to reflection on teachings?
Well, so it's the first two steps in the hearing and thinking are conceptual, and meditation is non-conceptual. The quote I honed in on was, "The truth revealed in meditation is a self-cognizing wisdom through which the mind knows its own nature to be an emptiness beyond all dualities, without the intermediaries of conceptual language."
Yeah, I think that's right. There's something, reflection is always dualistic. I think we touched on this point before, and there's something about the modern world where ever since the Enlightenment, the modern idea was that's all there is. Dualistic knowledge is all there is. Scientific knowledge is dualistic. That's the only valid form of knowledge. So we just focus on that, on growing that form of knowledge. Of course, it has grown, but we're saying there is an additional type of knowledge which is direct, non-dual, immediate, and unmediated by concepts, and that's what meditation is.
There are ripples of other things that Lama has mentioned here as well, about we've lost the ability to have stillness in our lives because of all the distractions. And so we have that challenge. That, like I emailed you earlier this week about how when we grew up, because we're all the same age, more or less, When we grew up, we didn't have the internet and we didn't have cell phones. And I'm not trying to suggest that that was a better time because of that, but it was certainly, it seems like there was certainly less distractions. And when I look at my kids now, God, they got so many distractions at their fingertips, you know, from video games to social media to YouTube. And I don't know, it does seem like a challenge for a lot of people just to be able to sit and to try and overcome conceptual.
Yeah, I think that's right. Meditation is essentially that, isn't it? It's letting go of that compulsion of I crave distraction, and that's there's something in meditation that's absolutely hits on that point, isn't it? Like not doing that, not grabbing the phone.
Yeah, Lama Jumper says that, you know, meditation is the third step, and you need hearing and thinking prior to meditation for it to be effective. And it directly makes the point, because it's so common in the West, isn't it? People think, oh, let's do some meditation, you know, and I'll, you know, become wise or discover the nature of my mind. But when it's not informed by the Buddhist teachings that we've heard and studied, which explain the nature of the world, the nature of mind, and what's really going on, without that backdrop and a deep understanding of that, then the meditation just simply becomes a way of, in a way, solidifying your pre-existing opinions and thoughts around the world, and you'll misinterpret the experience because you've got no other reference point other than your own ego as to what's happening and what's happening. So meditation without the context here and thinking, you know, can become more of a tool for the ego. You know, it's just another consumerist or fashion branding identity thing you can add on to becoming more me and what I am. I meditate and I do this, versus the purpose meditation, which is the direct realization of the nature of reality in a way. And then that nature of reality is pointed out through the teachings. We deepen our understanding, conceptual, through the reflection. But then the meditation is how we can then sit guided by those instructions and actually directly realize the non-dual nature of mind, which is beyond all concepts.
Yeah, I mean, he does conclude the chapter on this point by saying you need it. I mean, it's been said before, but he makes the point that you need a teacher at all of the stages of meditation. And there are different kinds of meditation, and you might have different teachers for different kinds of meditation. Like you might have one teacher, and actually for the thinking, because it says you might have one teacher teaching you philosophy and a different Buddhist philosophy, and a different teacher giving you initiations that enable you to meditate on what he calls the Vajra vehicle, which is the esoteric teaching. So yeah, I think that's the key that runs throughout this whole chapter. Is hearing, thinking, meditating at every stage needs to be a teacher.
But you know, this is from the get-go, from the beginnings of Dharma 2,500 years ago in India. Dharma's relationship to the surrounding culture, the surrounding kind of cultural environment, has always been to use what is supportive, what is in harmony with the ethical values of Dharma, and to use it as a support for the Dharma. It's a way of encasing Dharma in an appropriate cultural setting, whereas those elements in the culture that encourage selfishness and abuse of others and abuse of living creatures, they're of course always to be rejected. So wherever the Dharma went in Asia, it did this. It had, because the Dharma, the essence of the Dharma is transcultural. It's about finally that which transcends history, let alone culture. Then actually, happily enough, the Dharma can find a way to express itself through the particular culture of the place it meets, at least through the positive elements.
So we're going to go more into the experiential side of things in the next couple of chapters. So let's wrap up. Wisdom in Exile Radio, another fantastic episode. Thanks, Paul and Norin, for your enlightening and fascinating contributions. Truly mind-blowing. And we will be back in 2 weeks, I think, for continuing our wild and crazy ride through the swamps of samsara and the castles of nirvana. Mostly the swamps, yeah.